The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, but a sudden, violent freezing of the world. The prairie grasses, bleached white by the autumn sun, became brittle as glass. The creeks and rivers, which had murmured through the land just weeks before, were silenced under a thick armor of ice. For the settlers in the small, hopeful outpost of Prairie's End, the cold was not merely an inconvenience. It was an adversary, a relentless thief that crept through the walls of their carefully built cabins and stole the warmth from their hearths, their bodies, their very will to survive. The cold did not knock before it entered. It found its way through the slightest gap in the chinking between logs, a draft like a knife's edge slicing through the thin blanket of heat from the fire. It seeped through the glass of the windows, painting them with intricate, beautiful patterns of frost that belied their treachery. The settlers fought back with the only weapon they had: fire. The sound of axes splitting wood was the constant, frantic heartbeat of the community, a rhythm of desperation against the encroaching silence of the freeze. But the wood burned too fast. A man could spend a full day chopping, only to feed the stove all night and wake to a cabin barely above freezing, his breath a cloud in the air. The problem was universal. Every cabin in Prairie's End was a variation on the same theme, built from the same shared wisdom. They were sturdy, square structures of felled cottonwood, with broad, south-facing windows to catch the low winter sun. This was the way it was done. Silas, the community's most respected builder, a man whose hands were as tough and calloused as the bark of an old oak, had overseen the construction of nearly every home. His own cabin was considered the finest, yet even he fought the same losing battle. His wife coughed through the nights, and his children were always bundled in layers of wool, their faces pale. Tradition was a fortress, but its walls were proving to be porous. The old ways were not enough. The cold was winning. Into this struggle stepped Ilara. She was a widow, a quiet woman who had arrived 2 years prior with her husband, a German engineer named Karl. He had been a man of books and diagrams, full of ideas about stresses and loads and thermal dynamics. He saw the world in angles and principles. But the prairie was unimpressed by his knowledge. A fever had taken him in their first summer, leaving Ilara with their young son, Leo, and a trunk full of Karl's journals. The community regarded her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She was an outsider, a woman alone, her ways slightly different, her accent a soft echo of a world far from the harsh plains. They saw her as fragile, a hothouse flower transplanted to a land of ironweed and thistle. After a winter spent shivering in the cabin Karl had built to local specifications, a winter that nearly stole the life from her small son, Ilara knew she could not endure another. She spent the spring and summer poring over her late husband's journals. The pages were filled with his precise, elegant script, with drawings of bridges, gears, and most importantly, buildings designed for the brutal winters of the Russian steppes and the high Alps. Karl had been fascinated by how people survived in the coldest corners of the world. One principle appeared again and again in his notes, underlined and circled. The greatest enemy of warmth was not the absence of heat, but the presence of loss. Heat, he wrote, was a fugitive, always seeking escape. The trick was not to make more of it, but to build a better cage to hold it. Her idea began to form, a radical departure from the accepted wisdom of Prairie's End. The settlers prized their windows. They saw them as vital portals for light and a source of solar heat, however meager. Karl's calculations, however, told a different story. He had filled pages with equations, demonstrating that a single pane of glass, even in direct sun, lost exponentially more heat to the frigid outside air over a 24-hour period than it could ever hope to gain in a few hours of daylight. Windows, his journals declared, were holes. They were wounds in the skin of a house. Elada's plan was simple and, to her neighbors, insane. She would build a new cabin, a smaller one, and it would have almost no windows. She sold a small parcel of her land to afford the logs and supplies, and in the late summer began to lay the foundation. The first time Silas saw the outline she had marked in the dirt, he stopped his wagon. The shape was nearly a perfect square, smaller than any other family cabin. "Building a smokehouse, Elara?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. She looked up from her work, her face smudged with dirt. "A home, Silas," she replied, her voice steady. He grunted, his eyes scanning the plans she had sketched on a piece of board. He saw the thick foundation, the markings for a massive central chimney, but he saw no gaps for the customary large windows. "Where are your windows?" he asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "There will be only two," she said, pointing to two small, high rectangles marked on the north and east walls. "And they will have shutters." Silas stared at her, then threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming laugh that carried across the prairie. "A tomb," he declared, slapping his thigh. "You mean to live in a dark box all winter? The boy will get sick from the gloom, and you'll go mad before the thaw. You need the sun, woman. The sun gives life." He was not being cruel, merely stating what he believed to be an unassailable fact, a piece of wisdom as solid as the frozen earth beneath their feet. The community's reaction followed Silas's lead. As Elada's work progressed, her project became a source of local amusement and concern. It was dubbed Elada's Folly, or more derisively, the Widow's Box. Women would stop by on their way back from the creek, shaking their heads. "It's not natural to live without light," one told her. "The darkness will get into your soul." Men would offer unsolicited advice, suggesting she at least put in a proper south-facing window. "You'll be burning 10 candles a day just to see your own hand in front of your face," another warned. They saw her quiet persistence not as strength, but as stubborn foolishness, the grief-addled whim of a woman who didn't understand the rules of this place. Their mockery was a constant, low hum of disapproval, but Elada did not waver. She had her husband's books, and she had the memory of her son's shivering body. That was all the certainty she needed. Elada worked with a diligence that bordered on obsession. She could not afford to hire a full crew like the other families, so she did most of the labor herself. She rose before the sun, her small frame silhouetted against the pale dawn, and worked until the last light failed. She learned the heft and balance of an axe, felling smaller trees for interior framing and firewood. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. She dug the foundation deeper than anyone else in Prairie's End, lining it with fieldstones she had painstakingly collected and hauled in a small cart. This, Carl's journals explained, would keep the floor from freezing from below. Her patience was a thing to behold. She did not rush. Every log was carefully selected, shaped, and notched. Where other builders might accept a small gap, Elara would shave and sand the wood until the fit was nearly seamless. For the chinking, she ignored the standard mix of mud and grass. She followed a recipe from one of Carl's books, a laborious mixture of clay, sand, ash, and slaked lime that she prepared in small, careful batches. It took 3 times as long to apply, but it dried as hard as stone and did not crack in the dry, cold air. She worked in silence, her movements economical and precise, her focus absolute. While Elara toiled on her small, strange cabin, life in Prairie's End went on in its usual way. Silas and his crew were hired to build a new home for a family that had just arrived. They worked with practiced speed, their hammers echoing across the prairie in a confident, rapid rhythm. The cabin went up in a matter of weeks, a handsome, traditional structure with a wide porch and generous windows on its southern face. The new family was moved in and settled long before Ilara had even finished her roof. The men would sometimes watch her from their own work site, shaking their heads at her slow, peculiar methods. "She'll be lucky to have a roof over her head by the first snow," one of them remarked. Silas just grunted. "Let her build her box. She'll learn." The contrast was stark. The community built with speed and confidence, relying on generations of established practice. Their cabins were symbols of their shared identity, their collective understanding of how to survive. Ilara's work was a solitary act of dissent. She was not building a house, she was conducting an experiment. Her isolation was palpable. Children were told not to bother the strange widow. The other women, after their initial warnings were ignored, mostly left her alone. She was a puzzle they could not solve, and so they chose to disregard her. But Ilara was not lonely. She had the company of her husband's voice, speaking to her from the pages of his journals. The heart of her design, the element that drew the most scorn, was her treatment of the windows. She installed only 2, as planned. They were not large, just small rectangles, barely big enough for a person to put their head through. She placed them high on the walls, not for the view, but to let in a sliver of indirect light without creating a major source of heat loss near the living space. But the windows themselves were only half of the system. The truly revolutionary part was the shutters. They were not the simple, decorative planks found on other cabins. Ilara built them like miniature doors. Each one was 2 inches thick, constructed from 2 layers of wood with a tightly packed core of wool and dried moss for insulation. She didn't just hang them on the outside. She built a deep, inset frame around each window opening. When the shutter was closed, it nested snugly inside this frame. She then lined the edges of the frame with strips of canvas and rabbit fur, creating a nearly airtight seal. When bolted shut from the inside, the shutter became an integral part of the wall. The principle, as Carl had written, was to create a continuous, unbroken, insulated envelope. The window was a temporary breach in that envelope, to be sealed shut the moment the sun went down, or whenever the wind began to blow. The other key element was the hearth. It was not a simple fireplace tucked against a wall. Ilara built a massive column of stone and clay brick in the very center of the cabin's single room. It was a behemoth, taking up a surprising amount of the small floor space. It contained the firebox, an oven, and a flue that snaked back and forth through the masonry before it exited through the roof. This was the thermal mass, the heat battery her husband had described. The idea was to burn a small, hot fire, and the immense stone structure would absorb the heat, slowly and gently radiating it back into the room for hours and hours after the fire itself had died down to embers. It was a slow, steady source of warmth, the opposite of the roaring, hungry fires in her neighbors' stoves. The work was grueling. Lifting the heavy stones into place pushed her to the limits of her strength, but she did not stop. By the time the first flakes of snow began to drift from a leaden sky, her strange, windowless box was complete. The great storm did not announce itself with subtlety. It came as a rumor from the north, a whisper carried by trappers and traders of a cold unlike any they had ever known. They called it the White Wolf, a blast of Arctic air that had descended from the polar ice caps and was now howling its way south across the plains. For a week, the sky had a strange, luminous gray quality, and the air was unnervingly still. The temperature dropped steadily, each day colder than the last. Then, one afternoon, the northern horizon vanished behind a churning wall of white. The wind arrived first, a low moan that quickly rose to a shrieking, deafening roar. The storm fell upon Prairie's End like a physical weight. Snow did not fall, it flew horizontally, driven by winds that shook the foundations of the sturdiest cabins. It was a blizzard of unprecedented fury, a relentless assault of cold and wind. The world outside the door vanished into a blinding, swirling chaos. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, exposed skin would freeze in less than a minute. Metal became brittle enough to snap. The very air seemed to hurt the lungs. It was a cold that felt ancient and absolute, a force that wanted to erase the tiny, warm smudge of human life from the vast, frozen landscape. Inside the cabins of Prairie's End, a desperate battle was underway. The wind, like a relentless interrogator, found every flaw in their construction. It screamed through the eaves and whistled through the tiny, invisible cracks in the chinking. The broad, beautiful windows that were meant to gather the sun became fields of ice on the inside. Frost crept from the window panes onto the surrounding logs, a creeping tide of white. In Silas's cabin, the air was thick with smoke from the overworked stove. He fed it constantly, shoving log after log into its glowing maw, but the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the metal. A few feet from the stove, the air was tolerable. In the corners of the room, it was dangerously cold. His wife lay in bed, her breathing shallow, huddled under a mountain of blankets. The children cried, their fear a tangible thing in the frigid air. The woodpile, which he had thought would last a month, was shrinking at an alarming rate. The storm raged for 2 days without pause. For the settlers, it was a terrifying siege. The sound of the wind was a constant torment, a sound of immense, destructive power. Several families saw their woodpiles dwindle to nothing. They began burning furniture, crates, anything that would feed the fire. One family's cabin, hastily built and poorly chinked, became so cold that they were forced to abandon it, making a desperate, life-threatening dash through the blizzard to their nearest neighbor. The community, once a collection of self-reliant households, was breaking down under the strain. Fear turned to panic. They were trapped, and the cold was seeping in, relentless and implacable. The old ways were failing, and the price of that failure was being measured in human suffering. Now, shift the focus. Outside a small, nearly windowless cabin at the edge of the settlement, the same blizzard raged. The wind slammed against the solid log walls, but there were no large panes of glass to shudder and moan, no decorative shutters to rattle. The wind found no purchase, flowing over the simple, solid shape like water over a smooth stone. The snow piled up in deep drifts against the walls, but this was not a threat. It was a benefit. The snow, as Carl's journals had noted, was a superb insulator. The deeper the drifts, the more the cabin was buried in a protective, insulating blanket. Inside Ilara's Folly, there was silence. The deafening roar of the storm was muted to a distant, hollow whisper, the sound of a faraway sea. The air was still and calm. There were no drafts, and it was warm. Not the scorching, uneven heat of an overworked stove, but a steady, pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. The central stone hearth radiated a gentle, constant heat, like the warmth of the sun on a spring afternoon. A small, efficient fire flickered in the firebox, consuming a single, seasoned log every few hours. Ilara sat in a simple wooden chair, a book open in her lap, bathed in the soft, steady glow of an oil lamp. Her son, Leo, was not huddled under a pile of blankets. He was asleep on a pallet near the hearth, his breathing deep and regular, his face relaxed and peaceful. Ilara felt the deep, resonant hum of the stone mass, her husband's principle made real, and knew they were safe. The cage she had built was holding. The contrast was a chasm, a difference not of degrees, but of entire worlds. In Silas's cabin, the temperature had dropped to 35 degrees, despite the fire that was consuming his last few pieces of wood. The air was a misery of smoke, cold, and fear. In Ilara's cabin, a thermometer Carl had owned hung on the wall, its mercury steady at 68 degrees. It was an oasis of warmth and tranquility in the heart of the storm's fury. Over the 2 days of the blizzard's peak, Silas had burned through more than half a cord of precious firewood. A glance at Ilara's wood box showed that she had used barely a quarter of that amount. Her efficiency was not just a matter of comfort. It was the difference between survival and disaster. On the 3rd day of the storm, Silas faced a terrible choice. His wood was gone. The fire in his stove was dying, and the cold in the cabin was now a mortal threat. His wife's cough had grown weaker, more ragged. He looked at the faces of his children, blue-lipped and shivering, and his pride, once a mountain, crumbled into dust. He had to get more wood. But his woodpile was buried under 10 feet of snow, and the neighbor he would normally turn to was in the same dire situation. He thought of the widow. He remembered his own laughter, his confident pronouncements of her folly. He imagined her frozen, desperate, perhaps even worse off than he was. But it was a chance. He had to try. He bundled himself in every layer he owned, pulled his hat down low, and stepped out into the screaming, white hell of the blizzard. The walk was a nightmare. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the breath from his lungs. The snow was so deep he had to fight for every step, his legs burning with effort. He couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of him, navigating by instinct and a desperate prayer. It was a journey of only 200 yards, but it felt like miles. When he finally stumbled against the solid wall of Ilara's cabin, he was exhausted, half frozen, and filled with a dreadful certainty that he had come all this way only to find a tomb. He hammered on the door with a numb fist, his blows sounding weak and small against the roar of the wind. The door opened. A wave of calm, steady warmth washed over him, so profound and unexpected it felt like a physical blow. It was not the smoky, scorching heat of a stove, but something else entirely. A clean, even, life-giving warmth. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight. He saw Ilara, her expression calm, her face betraying no surprise. He saw the boy, Leo, sitting on the floor, contentedly playing with a carved wooden horse. He saw the massive stone hearth, radiating heat like a living thing. He saw the small, slow-burning fire, and next to it a neatly stacked pile of firewood, large enough to last another week. There was no frost on the walls. There were no drafts. There was only peace. Silas stood there, speechless, the frozen mask of his face melting into an expression of utter disbelief. The reality of the scene before him was a complete repudiation of everything he thought he knew. He, the master builder, was freezing to death in his own expertly crafted cabin. This woman, this foolish, stubborn widow, was living in a pocket of summer. He had come to offer help, or perhaps to beg for wood, expecting to find her in despair. Instead, he found salvation. Ilara did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." She saw the desperation in his eyes, the ice clinging to his beard, and her expression softened with compassion. "Come in, Silas," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the howl of the storm. "It is cold outside." She stepped back and held the door open for him. He stumbled inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, and the roar of the blizzard was instantly silenced, replaced by the gentle crackle of the fire. The warmth enveloped him, seeping into his frozen limbs, and with it came a feeling of profound, crushing humility. He was wrong. He had been so completely, arrogantly, and dangerously wrong. He sank onto a small stool she offered him, too stunned to speak, and gratefully accepted the steaming mug of broth she placed in his hands. The storm finally broke on the 4th day. The wind died down, and a weak, watery sun appeared in a sky of washed-out blue. The world was transformed, buried under a sea of sculpted white. As soon as it was safe, Silas made his way back to his own cabin, his mind reeling from what he had seen. He did not speak of it at first, but the change in him was undeniable. He was quieter, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a deep, contemplative silence. But news in a small, isolated community travels on currents of its own. The story of Silas's visit to the widow's cabin during the storm's peak began to circulate, whispered from one family to the next. At first, there was disbelief. But then, others began to venture out. A neighbor, whose own woodpile was exhausted, went to Ilara's to ask for a few logs. He returned not just with the wood, but with a look of awe on his face. It's like summer in there," he stammered to his wife. "The air is warm all over, and her fire is tiny." One by one, drawn by curiosity and a dawning sense of wonder, others made the pilgrimage to the windowless cabin on the edge of the settlement. They would knock hesitantly, and Ilara would welcome them in. Each visitor had the same reaction. They would stop just inside the door, stunned into silence by the profound, steady warmth. They would stare at the massive stone hearth, at the small, efficient fire, at the thick, insulated shutters bolted tight against the cold. The laughter was gone. The mockery was forgotten. In its place grew a quiet, burgeoning respect. Ilara's folly was no longer a joke. It was a miracle. A week after the storm, Silas returned. He did not come to borrow wood or to seek shelter. He stood at her door, his hat in his hands, his face etched with a humility that had been entirely foreign to him before. He looked not at her, but at the ground, like a student before a master. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, a proud, blind fool. I laughed at you. But my family nearly froze because of my pride. Your way, it is the right way." He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. "Teach me," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a complete surrender of ego. It was the moment the entire community's perspective shifted, crystallized in the earnest plea of its most respected and most mistaken man. Ilara did not hesitate. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of purpose. She invited him in and unrolled her late husband's diagrams on the small wooden table. She did not present the knowledge as her own, but as the careful, studied wisdom of the man she had loved. "It is not my way, Silas," she said softly. "It is just a different way of thinking about the cold." She pointed to the drawings of the central hearth. "The stone is a bank for the heat," she explained. "You make small deposits with a hot fire, and it pays you back with steady warmth all day and all night. Your stoves, they are like shouting. This is like whispering." She showed him the cross-section drawings of the insulated shutters, explaining the principle of the thermal break. "The window is the weakness," she said, tapping the diagram. "When it is dark or the wind blows, the wall must be whole again. You must seal the wound." She brought him the leftover materials, letting him feel the density of the wool packing and the thickness of the wood. She explained the airtight seal, the deep frame, the importance of stopping every tiny draft. She shared everything freely, answering his questions with patience and clarity. She held nothing back. The knowledge was not a secret to be hoarded for power or profit. It was a tool for survival, and it belonged to anyone who needed it. That spring, the sound of construction in Prairie's End was different. The familiar rhythm of saws and hammers was joined by the slow, heavy scrape of stone on stone. No new cabins were built the old way. Under Silas's fervent direction, the entire community began to rebuild, retrofitting their existing homes and constructing new ones based on the widow's way. They tore out their large, south-facing windows, replacing them with the small, high openings and thick, insulated shutters Ilara had designed. They built massive stone hearths in the centers of their homes, a task that required immense collective effort as men worked together to haul and lift the heavy rocks into place. The physical landscape of the settlement began to change. The cabins, once varied in their details, began to share a common, stark aesthetic. Solid, nearly windowless walls and prominent central chimneys. They looked less like homes and more like small, humble fortresses. They were monuments to a hard-won lesson. Silas, once the chief skeptic, was now the most zealous convert, meticulously overseeing every detail, ensuring that each shutter sealed perfectly and every hearth was built to the exact heat-retaining specifications. He worked with the fervor of a man atoning for a grave sin. The story of Prairie's End and its strange, warm cabins began to spread across the territory. A surveyor, forced to winter in the settlement, was skeptical of the windowless homes until he spent a night in one during a sudden cold snap. He left in the spring with a set of copied diagrams and a story that bordered on the fantastical. A traveling preacher spoke of a community saved from a great blizzard by the wisdom of a quiet widow, casting it as a parable of humility and providence. The design, with its focus on thermal mass and minimal openings, became known in the region as the Dakota Keep. It was a style born not of aesthetics, but of brutal necessity and brilliant, counterintuitive logic. Families in new settlements, hearing the tales, began building their first homes not with wide windows to greet the sun, but with thick walls to defeat the cold. Elara never sought credit or praise. She lived quietly in her small, warm cabin, raising her son. She watched as the community transformed around her, her heart filled not with pride, but with a deep sense of peace. Her reward was not the esteem of her neighbors, though she had it in abundance. Her reward was the sound of her son's healthy breathing in the dead of winter. It was the simple, profound comfort of a home that was truly a shelter, a sanctuary against the storm. The legacy of her work was written in stone and wood across the prairie, in every family that survived the next winter, and the one after that, warm and safe. The final lesson of Elara's folly was not about engineering or architecture. It was a lesson in humility. It taught the people of Prairie's End that the loudest voice is not always the wisest, and that true strength often resides in quiet observation and the courage to question what everyone else believes to be true. Wisdom, they learned, did not always come from generations of tradition, but sometimes from the pages of a book, carried across an ocean by a stranger. It was a reminder that the most powerful force for change is not arrogant certainty, but the simple, desperate need to protect the ones you love, and the quiet determination to find a better way.